Well, he made his way in this morning from icy Brookside. Patrick Tuohey with the Show Me Institute's here. How you doing, my man?
I'm great, and I'm in Waldo. How dare you?
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
How dare you?
I did not mean to
No, that's
insult
fine.
you like that.
I am a big fan of the Waldo neighborhood, just south of Brookside, but I think much better and certainly much more affordable. We got a lot going on there.
You do, absolutely. Roads were okay?
Roads were fine. The path to my car from the back door was treacherous, and I took a spill. Yeah.
Oh, no. Oh, you going to be in physical therapy for weeks, or are you going to be okay?
I hope not. I'll be fine. I got here, but it does, it's one of those things that happens to you when you start remembering, I'm an old man. I don't recover as quickly as in my youth.
You're not an old man. What are you, 45?
I'm 53.
Okay. All right.
Almost 60.
I was. Oh, man. All right. Well, let me ask you about what's going on with Missouri Governor Mike Kehoe. He introduced his budget. You were not impressed.
Well, it was just the state of the state.
Yeah.
He talked a lot about the things he wants to spend money on: public safety, police, education, veterans. But his proposed budget was bigger than Mike Parsons' last budget. And Mike Parsons spent a lot of money over the last 5 years. In fact, the Cato Institute rated him the worst, certainly Republican governor in the country. And Mike Parsons spent so much money that he came in below Gavin Newsom and Tim Walz, progressive governors. So Kehoe has a lot of work ahead of him. He's got to right-size the budget. The legislature has got to cut spending. Again, he just came into office. I don't envy his job. I am optimistic that he will get his hands around this, but this first budget is not promising because it's more than already a too big budget.
See, I know you can't get into his head. I'm not going to ask you to, but he knows that.
Yes.
We also know that we have a legislature that wants to eventually eliminate the state income tax.
Yes.
So how do you square these two things together?
Well, that's exactly the right question. And let me say, I think moving the income tax to zero is worthwhile. It is what Missouri needs to be competitive. We are losing population relative to the rest of the country. We're not growing as fast. Our contribution to the national GDP is shrinking. We're not doing as much.
Is that right? Wow.
And we're losing to states that have right to work. We're losing to states that have reformed their education system. We're losing to states that have lower income tax. So we need to move in that direction. That is good. However, when you're going to cut a source of revenue that accounts for 60% of the state revenue, the income tax, you've got to pair it with spending cuts. It's not easy, but the legislature has got to work with the governor and identify where they're going to spend less money. It's the only way forward.
Now, what do you think they're thinking then in the legislature? They're just going to do this and kind of hope it works out like Kansas did?
Well, my fear is that they don't want to make those tough decisions, that a lot of them are just saying, hey, look, we're just going to cut revenue. We're going to cut the income tax, and we'll starve the beast, and we'll worry about those tough cutting decisions later on. But
when a lot of these folks aren't even going to be there, right?
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
They're making problems for, much like Parson did for Kehoe, today's legislature is making problems for tomorrow's legislature. Look, what happened, your listeners all remember 10 years ago, Governor Brownback of Kansas introduced or wanted a bunch of tax cuts. The legislature wanted their own group of tax cuts. They compromised and did them both. So we got a lot of tax cuts in Kansas, but they didn't pair it with spending cuts. So what happened when the kind of national economy hit a bump? Kansas took a hit in the ag sector and the aerospace sector. When they had to scramble to make up that revenue, the Kansas City Star and lots of pundits said, they blamed it on the tax cuts. You shouldn't have had the tax cuts. So what Missouri needs to do is anticipate that if they don't do the important work of actually cutting spending, they'll 5 years from now, 10 years from now, they may be in the same spot where they lose the opportunity to make a small government argument. They've got to increase taxes because they never did the work today of actually cutting spending.
What do you think, Patrick Tuohey, the obvious things are to cut? Where would you be looking?
So that's a great question. And certainly Medicaid, we've got to look at how much we're spending there. Parson introduced some programs that I'd love to cut back. For example, he said that the state is going to take over some teacher salary spending, which just encouraged all the school districts to kind of back off so that the state would pick up the difference. We need to get rid of that. School districts need to be responsible for meeting their own salary. The governor can use a, what do they call it? The line item veto. That's great. But what we really need is a discussion. I would love for them to get rid of economic development subsidies, which don't work and cost hundreds of millions of dollars. But it's going to require the legislature doing its job, going through all these programs and finding opportunities to cut and not just, again, bank on waste, fraud, and abuse. That's important, but that's not sufficient to get us where we need to be.
So as you look then at the way forward, I mean, Kehoe's a smart guy. He's got smart people around him. Is he kicking the can down the road, or is he just saying, hey, these are my priorities, knowing full well he's not going to get everything?
Certainly that may be, although he's got supermajorities in the legislature, so he may get everything he's asking for. He just needs to ask for better things. And again, he just came in office. Mm-hmm. This is his first budget. He's kind of getting his arms around what the problem is, although he's been there for a while, so it's not all new to him. And so, again, maybe he doesn't want to come out in his first speech and say, we're going to cut everything, but I hope the people around him are taking a serious look. And again, I don't want to let the legislature off the hook. They're going to have to do some of the work too, and these are going to be unpopular decisions. But if you want to reduce the size of government, it's not just taxes, it's spending as well. And we all know that, but Republicans have been able to skate on that in Missouri by pretending it's not the case.
How big are the reserves, and what do you think they will use those for? Will they use those to pay, air quotes, for these tax cuts, knowing full well it's just kind of kicking the can down the road?
Probably. Yeah. I mean, again, they don't want to make the tough decisions, and I appreciate that. But my fear is that 5 or 10 years down the road, when we don't make the spending cuts, we will lose all the gains to the income tax and will be no better off than we were a few years ago. And again, to the people listening who are left of center, I just want to make the case that we've got to cut income taxes. We've got to do things to be more competitive because, we lost a congressional seat years ago, and that's because the rest of the country is growing faster. Missouri's on a glide path to zero. We can't just stand still and hope that things turn around. We've got to actively shrink government.
And then, of course, some will say, maybe some of those left of center will say, but, Patrick, we don't have the beaches of Florida. We don't have the oil industry of Texas. And,
Nope, that is right. People are leaving Missouri for Florida and Texas. And, yes, we can't legislate the climate, but they're also leaving to Tennessee, which is very similar to Missouri. It's landlocked. It's got 2 big cities that it counts on to be the engines of its economy. We have the same thing. But look, even Washington State did away with its income tax. It's not necessarily a conservative thing. It's states looking at it, realizing that they're in competition with the rest of the country and saying, what's our competitive advantage? We can't tax and spend like we used to because people today are more free to pick up and move than they ever have been before. And we've got to argue to them, we're a great place to live and to open up a business, and being more competitive with income tax is a part of that.
So is Tennessee the state that you think is most comparable to where you would want to see Missouri go?
Yeah, I'd love to head in that direction. Now, Tennessee's got its own problems. Nashville is growing really fast, too fast, frankly. Yeah. It doesn't have the infrastructure. So, again, all these states, it's not just a matter of growing or shrinking. It's a matter of making sure that your government is providing those basic services, including infrastructure and transportation, and doing so as cheaply as possible. But just standing still and saying we're fine, we don't want to make these tough decisions, is not just a failure today, but I think it's going to, if we don't do the work now, we're really going to take it on the chin in a few years. So I'm optimistic, guardedly optimistic that Kehoe and his team know this. I don't envy their job, but there's no other way. If we're going to cut the income tax, we've got to cut spending. And part of it may be just kind of restructuring how we collect and spend money. My colleagues at the Show Me Institute have written a paper about a taxpayer bill of rights that kind of observes that the Hancock Amendment hasn't been the bulwark against government growth that it should have been. People have found lots of loopholes, and maybe it's not just cutting spending. It's a restructuring and making sure that we tie the hands of legislators in the future so they can't get carried away and spend more money. But there's a lot on his plate.
Well, all that COVID money that just poured into these states gave me, I think, a false sense of security.
And again, I don't. I would say I don't want to beat up on Parson too much, but he made some really bad decisions. He took one-time COVID money and used it to commit the state to salary, for example, to commit them in perpetuity to paying people more. You get a one-time settlement, right? In our life, we get a lotto winning. You use it to what? Pay down your debts, maybe redo some things in your house. You don't use it to take on other long-term obligations.
But I'll say this too. I mean, Parson had a Republican legislature that went along with all this.
Exactly. That is exactly right. And again, these guys, they talk a good game about limited government. They've actually got to show up and do the work.
I agree. Patrick Tuohey on KCMO. Well done, my man.
Thank you so much.
Hey, don't fall when you're leaving the office
be safe,
today.
everyone.
All right. Yes, absolutely.